Welcome to Fireside Chat number 16. As usual, we pick a topic just before we start recording, and it's the kind of conversations that we used to have when we were working together and in the evening over a drink. We'd have these conversations. These are our opinions, expressed often sometimes quite unqualified, but we find that these are quite interesting, and we decided to record them, and people seem to like them. So as usual, if you like them, please subscribe and send us comments and send us ideas for chats as well that you would like us to discuss. So today we are going to talk about how does architecture impact the organization. So often we hear Conway's law is quoted quite often, and the inverse Conway law is also quoted quite often. And architecture has a very close relationship with organizations, right? So without further ado, so what do you guys think? How does architecture impact the organization?
Jose, you start while I think. So I need time to digest that, to organize my thoughts.
Well, I think let's start at the beginning. No, like you mentioned Conway's law, you mentioned architecture. It would be good to start by kind of setting a baseline for those. Conway's law, if I'm not quoting from memory, but it's basically an organization that designs systems will build systems that tend to reflect the communication patterns within the organization, right? So if you have different silos, that normally the systems that you create will kind of represent the same borders or the same blocks or units, no, that you will find in the communication structure of the organization. Again, you can look it up, it's on Wikipedia, whatever, but so that's kind of what we're referring to, like how usually the systems tend to mirror the communication structure of the organization, and the reverse would be, can we, by changing the systems or the architecture in the systems, can we change the organization, right? That's one thing. Then the other is architecture, and I guess that for the purpose of what we're going to be discussing, we're going to use a definition of architecture that is relatively narrow. No, we're going to probably focus more around how we structure those systems, how they're split, or what kind of dependencies maybe they have between it, and not so much maybe which technology you choose to use or things like this, right? Or going to the level of the micro design if you're using layer thing and so on. No. And with those two out of the way, I feel like this is a bit of a chicken and egg kind of situation, no? Because they both affect each other, right? Like you can often see how the structure is reflected in the system, but when you start changing the system, it also affects how the organization works. So which one takes precedence is part of the thing, no? And you often see this in things like microservice architectures, no, or monoliths, and they definitely have an impact, whether it's at different levels, no, things like how the teams are structured or what kind of processes or workflows we follow. That you can look at it from different perspectives, if you will, no. And I think that would be a good kind of approach to move forward. Well, I don't know, what do you think, Sandro?
So I think that maybe we can talk about what kind of impact, because like when we said, like, okay, so we understood that the Conway's law is quite common, so that the systems are designed in a way that reflects the communication patterns in the organization. And when we try to do the reverse and rearrange our systems, that should create an impact in the organizational part. But what exactly impact we are talking about? Exactly. So I was thinking about a few as you were speaking. I was trying to think about a few. So, for example, one is the communication among people and teams, right? And the another thing is the ownership as well. So those are, I have more, but like just start there. So for example, if you have a monolith, everyone works on the same code base. It's difficult to structure that communication well, right? And I'll explain different facets of that communication. There is one
What do you mean exactly? Like communication well between the people working in that code base?
Exactly, in that system in general, not only the developers, but the testers, the product owners, everyone, that their job revolves around that system. Yeah, and because it's a single system, the communication patterns in there are very complex, right? So, because for example, developers, they need to synchronize their changes and they keep stepping each other's toes. So there is a huge degree of effort to avoid conflicts of changes, right? So they need to put far more effort in that communication. Feature-wise is the same. So for example, I remember working quite a few projects that the product owners themselves, the people that were creating the different types of, because although it's a single system, there are multiple streams of features, right? They want to change different parts of the system at the same time, and they have multiple teams. So the product owners, for example, they had to coordinate among themselves and constantly speak to the technical people to say, hey, we want to have those features here, but does it conflict with those other features over there? Would we need to use the same kind of people because the expertise, because it's a single system, the expertise is also shared in a way. Testing the same thing as well. They had to synchronize, once they wanted to release something, they had to synchronize the testing cycles as well. So this is an example that a type of architecture, which is a monolith, creates a certain type of communication, and there is a lot of effort in order to make that communication style to work. A microservice, that would be the other extreme, and we have different architectural patterns in between, would make those certain things easier and others more complicated. So there is less synchronization that needs to be done because the systems are significantly separate from each other, as long as they keep the same interface, the same API. The different streams of work, they don't need to have to put a lot of effort in collaboration. They can evolve those different areas without much collaboration. The developers, the same thing. There is less people to coordinate the changes because those changes are far more isolated than others. This is just an example. I don't want to spend too much time. But this is an example of how an architecture can impact the organization.
And you also didn't mention it when you were doing this, but you mentioned ownership, and that's also very clear. No, when you have a microservice, you usually have a team that owns kind of like that piece of the system. That's what gives them kind of like the sometimes but
because this is a common pattern. But yeah, we have other patterns where you still have collective ownership in a microservices. We can also discuss that. But like, sorry, I interrupted. Keep going. I just wanted to.
No. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It is like, I mean, that's part of the beauty of it. No, like sometimes you may have someone who completely owns that part. Yeah. Sometimes you may have someone who sets guidelines. Multiple people can contribute, but they are setting certain guidelines. And all the times it's just free for all. Right. It's again not a single way of doing it. No, that's the beauty of it. No.
Yeah, in case we want to push ownership, it would be easier to have the separation when the architecture allows that to happen. Like in the microservice, it would be much easier to isolate and have a more clear ownership of certain areas than if we had an architecture like a monolith. That would be much harder to apply. Mash, sorry, you were...
No, that's fine. I think there is another dimension that we probably need to kind of throw in there, and that is, it's not related to microservices or monolith. It's related to the entire ecosystem of systems, the kind of enterprise architecture, as it were. And it's not that prevalent in smaller organizations, but it's almost always there in the larger organization, where you would have departments that have been siloed for a very, very long time, and they are building these systems that are actually horizontals of the company's service or product delivery. Sometimes it's regulatory, because they have certain laws related to, what happens where in which parts of the organization. Other times it's just cultural and historical. The organization were split in that particular way, and so all these, the product, as it were, for that organization is huge, built up of many systems by organizations that have not a lot to do with each other, but they need to communicate in order to get the whole service out for that company. So I think this is another dimension. It's maybe at a higher level, because you can then have this idea of monolith or microservices within each one of those departments, right? And I think that's also worth considering.
Yeah, there are extreme cases. I remember when we were at UBS and speaking to one of the, I think that they had a group CTO, right? That's where most of the architects, enterprise architects were. And they were looking at more than 700 systems. We looked at 5 of those systems, and each one of those 5 systems were huge systems. So that's a much bigger degree of complexity that you were saying, Ash.
It's kind of microservices complexity, but at the systems level, right?
Exactly.
so that I mean, and this basically goes back to that kind of Conway's law. I mean, in those situations, it's always, that's how the organization was set up, and the systems have evolved accordingly. And I think that kind of thing, in order to change, and this is the other thing, maybe I don't know if you want to talk about it now or a bit later, is normally the interesting, I guess, things happen, or the discussions arise when you start looking at evolving these things, or when you start looking at the pain points. And I think maybe first of all, it's better to understand the pain points, right? Because if, for example, systems have been built in a particular way, organization was designed in a particular way, and suddenly the business requires organizations to start working in a different way. So I'll give you an example. Take retail. The retail evolved from bricks and mortar, where there was very much kind of ERP type systems, and tills and very traditional kind of stock order processing and all those kind of things. And then suddenly the whole idea of e-commerce started, which was done at the side of the things. And now we are talking about very much a single view of the customer, right? And suddenly there is a business pressure for all these different systems to work in a very, very close way, in a much more integrated way. But the organizations are still not integrated. They are pretty kind of disjoint. And this is one of the pain points where actually companies are finding extremely difficult to have that integrated view of the customer. The customer is asking, like, I started creating this basket online. Why can't I come to to your shop and say, okay, I have that basket, just give me those items, right? Or I've done
or
it
even
there,
like order at store and have it delivered at home.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. I'm going to look at these things, but I just want them delivered to my house. Exactly. So those kind of things are now, there is a business pressure, but the organization is not aligned in that way, and the systems are definitely not aligned because of that. So that's one kind of major pain point. And I think it'll be good to to discuss those kind of pain points as well. When we start changing, when the business needs change, what happens then to the organizations or to the systems? You talk about chicken and egg, Jose. Well, which one do you start changing first then? Do you start changing the organization? Or do you start changing the system?
The chicken and egg doesn't have answer, Mash. Like the chicken and egg is not meant to be answered. You're not meant to pick one.
No,
you have to start somewhere.
But you're bringing up, I think, a point that is quite interesting, which is that a lot of the time that organizational change is triggered by the adoption of technology or similar, right? And the example that you were saying before, when you're finding a solution to something like that, right, from a business perspective, yeah. The initial, point of view is, okay, so what's in the market? Like, like there are all of these companies that, we need to adopt SAP, or whatever. And then everyone will have to use this, right? And that's the thing that is bringing out all of the problems, right? Like all of the silos, all of the, things that are being done in isolation or repeated, or, like all, and that's when you start being conscious of the waste, and when you start being conscious of all of these areas that you need to improve. Yeah. And usually what happens is that you need to be very flexible with it, because there's no one way that will fit, everyone in the organization, right? And especially when it's been evolving the way that it has so far, right? Like from one day to the next, people will not, it won't be easy to have people use a system or work in a particular way, right? So trying to push it is going to be hard in that sense. But it comes from, when you start the implementation, and when you go down and say, hey, this will be great, how do we do it? No, it's when things start. So from that perspective, could you do something beforehand in order to set the stage for something like that to happen in a more, in an easier way? Yeah. Or is it something that you're always going to find this friction, right? Like once you start implementing, you're going to find it doesn't matter what it is that you're doing. Can you even avoid that? No, to some extent.
They need to work side by side, right? So I don't think you can just pick one completely in isolation. I want you to evolve that example that Mesh was giving because it was a very concrete case that we had, because we went through that on the e-commerce side. And because there was a department called online. The online department was the new department where they were doing all the website for that company, selling the products online. And the actual physical stores, they were a completely different department, much, much bigger, because that department not only looked after the systems for the physical stores, but they looked after the systems for the warehouses as well, all the logistics
processes, yeah.
Exactly, the fulfillment process and stuff. So then the kind of systems, first of all, the systems that were built for the bricks and mortar, like so the physical stores, they were way older, because that business started in the 60s or something along those lines, and then the systems were introduced a little bit later, and there were there was still mainframe running, I think, in some of them, and COBOL in other parts, and all sorts of technologies. And by nature, they work, not only the systems that the technologies were different, culturally they were different, because as they started decades earlier, they also worked in a much more waterfall way. And their relationship with their suppliers and technical people was also different when you compare to the online. So in terms of organizations, although they were the same company, they had absolutely zero in common. Like where the online was more agile, that everything was more integrated, more modern technologies and stuff. So, and then all of a sudden, what the business said, hey, you know what? Online is growing. The physical stores are coming down. We want to have omni-channel. That's what Mashooq was referring to. So we want the stores don't have all the stock, all the catalog. So if people go to the stores and they don't find what they want, they could go and order from the shop. And then you might say, but what? Well, then they go to the website. Well, but if they go to the website, if they just open the browser and went to the website for the online, they would not have the trace for the client. They would not know that that client was a client that actually went to the store and had that account and stuff. And so basically the client base was separate, right? They could not combine the clients. So in order to establish omnichannel, they had to start unifying the concept of clients, the concept of products, because again, the products was also separate. The products that were on the online side, they were fulfilled by different warehouses. And the store were, so the product was separate, the client base was separate. So then the business said, hey, we want omni-channel. So this is not just a simple change in systems, because you had to unify those systems. But when you unify those systems, quite often you need to either you decommission one and you migrate the old one, well, one of them, you move all the data from one to the other and then make all the necessary changes. Or you create even a new one and decommission both sides. And then you now have a service in the middle that would be a client or a product, so on. Those new systems or those changes, now they are shared by people from two completely different organizations. So who owns them? Which technology do you go? What is the technical vision for those components? See what I mean? So now they have pressures to evolve from different sides of the organization. So who coordinates those changes, right? So how do you prioritize them? So this is where all of a sudden the architecture forces the organization to become far more integrated, force them to collaborate better, right? So that's when you start breaking the silos. Some of those changes might even be harmful depending on how you make them. But quite often, this is a good opportunity as we are re-architecting the systems to create this, what we call the inverse Conway's maneuver, like use a new architecture as you rearrange the systems to fit the business, but also to cause a positive impact in how people collaborate. And that's a very concrete example.
There is an evolutionary thing to this, and the thing is, this kind of thing people do take different attitudes to it. And Jose also asked, like, do you do something before you bring about these kind of changes, or before you start this thing? And I'll tell you, there are certain anti-patterns that I have certainly seen, and maybe one or two things maybe I think that could work, right? One big anti-pattern is to stick a great big middleware in between, right? To say, okay, I'm bringing a I don't know, some kind of middlewares into this that will, in a way, I've seen multiple implications of this. I've seen it being done in like gigaspaces, which is kind of a distributed kind of event grid, to kind of evolved service-oriented service buses like MuleSoft and so on, right? And where they say, well, we're going to have governance, and we're going to bring all this data into the middle, and then we will have an ecosystem of services that are using this data. And in theory, I don't think there's anything wrong with the idea, but normally the way that idea becomes implemented, and this is another anti-pattern, is that a dominant department takes lead, doesn't involve the other departments too much, because it's dominant, says, okay, this is how we're going to do it. We are sticking this middleware in between, right? This is another anti-pattern. And everyone else, you must, like it or lump it, you're going to have to live with this, right? So we will set it up, and then you'll start consuming, and then you'll start decommissioning or not using your databases and come into this. This is another big anti-pattern. Another thing that I have seen is bringing in a brand new off-the-shelf do-it-all solution. And I'm sorry, but SAP comes to mind here, right? We are gonna bring in SAP, yeah. Like all this stuff, bespoke things that you build is rubbish. We're gonna bring in SAP, plonk it in the middle, and suddenly most of what
And
you've done is gonna be
and
redundant.
no, and then build a lot of custom stuff
Custom
on top
around it.
of it.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. This is kind of almost like similar to a SOA-based approach,
Yeah.
right? Uh, the other way that they kind of do is APIs, right? Well, Amazon have done it. We are now gonna do APIs. We're gonna build, each one of the departments is gonna have a well-defined interface built around certain APIs. And suddenly they say, oh yeah, you know what? We need the API gateway. We need, I don't know, like Apogee or these kind of things that will, in a way, govern the interfaces between these organizations, and then they can do whatever they like behind them, because you know what, we have agreed, we have the API gateways, right? Excuse me, should have so so there's so these are some of the anti-patterns. I'm sure there
One
are others as
one
well.
thing that I would add to that is that even in the cases where they stick the middleware in middle, like even if there's someone like pushing that, like you mentioned it as a dominant department or product or whatever you want to call it. No, it's just kind of like leading that transition. What usually happens is that that middle, two things. One is once it's set up, usually there's not a clear ownership of it, and then maybe the group that started it doesn't want to onto it, because that would mean dedicating resources to maybe serving other people who have needs over it. Yeah. Or it becomes like a sticky ball, right? Like everything that I don't want to have to deal with because I don't have budget or I don't have resources, I send it to that group to be implemented in the middleware, right? I don't want to touch the product. I'll have this integrators do the work, right? And that quickly ends up in a space where there's lots of domain logic or things that are related to specific areas that are not under their control, right? They're administered or evolved, let's say, or maintained by someone else, right? Nobody knows about them, and you get this spread out either data or logic or whatever, right? Like that. This all one thing that comes to mind is processing, right? Like processing of whatever, no, like files, data, using things to move, files from one system to the next. But of course it's not just a mere conversion. You need to do other stuff in order to, so now you're quickly moving things that are should be under specific domain. They're spreading out to other areas of the of the architecture or the system, right? And that can happen really quickly and without noticing it, right? Especially if it's one of these, do all kind of, Swiss Army knife kind of things, no? That make it kind of easy for you to go down that road. No?
So I don't want to spend too much time on exactly this stuff. There are a few other things that I'd like to talk about, but I just want to do the devil's advocate here. So when SOA was introduced, if I'm not wrong, it was in 1996, and so someone will probably correct me, but that's what I roughly remember, because it was roughly when I was joining the industry. And I understand that, like, later on, the scenario that you mentioned, Mash, like there was at some point in the 2000s, there was a big drive to APIs. I remember, like, all large organizations, they say, hey, all our major systems should start exposing APIs. Let's introduce those middlewares and stuff. And I found that I recognize all the problems that you mentioned, because they were just perpetuating the lack of collaboration across departments, and they were perpetuating the silos, right? Say, look, don't speak to me. my system, I think that the other departments might be interested in these kind of APIs. So those APIs were not tailored to a specific need or a specific system or client. It was just let's start exposing APIs that follow a specific standard. And we had SOP, we have like the SOAP. I mean, like, so all that kind of stuff. So in those middlewares, I understand what the goal was. The intent was all the systems expose API, and then in theory, which I haven't seen work well, we could combine that information to whatever the business might need. So the goal was interesting in terms of providing an easy collaboration across systems. The implementation for me was lousy, but that was a business decision impacting the architecture. Like, doing a devil's advocate, how would we solve, like, for example, what would be a positive impact that a more modern architecture could still provide that communication across system and also enhance the collaboration? I have my own opinions, but I just wanted to do the devil's advocate and see what you guys think.
I mean, one thing that Jose and I think we've done a talk with Redis about this as well, right? Is providing a platform. So it's not, you're not really providing, you don't have a central organization that's doing governance on interfaces and those kind of things. By the way, earlier when you mentioned standard APIs, I thought, well, that's actually a good thing, but I didn't mean SOAP or REST. Or if it's standard, an industry standard based, like, you've got in trading like Swift and those kind of things. But anyway,
it's because you mentioned you mentioned enterprise service bus and all these aggregators.
Yeah.
And back in the day, I remember all the SOAP protocol.
Yeah, exactly. No, that yeah. So sorry, I've kind of lost my lost the track. What was I talking about?
You were talking about standardized APIs. It was a good thing, and you mentioned a talk that you, Jose, gave with Redis and
yeah, exactly. Thank you. So your question was, is there something that we can do in a better way? And I think there, like, I talked about anti-patterns, but there can be some good patterns as well. One is from a technology point of view, is make the job of integrating different systems and services easier and better. So we were actually talking about like almost like a data fabric, where you have a platform that allows information interchange and also the ability to store information and kind of expose interfaces like public and private data into a central place. That from a platform perspective, it could actually enable departments to start integrating at a technology level. So that's one thing. And there's a lot more to be said about that, but that's one area. Technically, you can facilitate integration, you can facilitate a more reliable way of sharing information, both especially public information that the systems may want to share with each other, right? So, but the other thing that is even much more important in my view is the organizational aspect. Is that when you are talking about certain siloed organizations that are then suddenly need to start talking to each other, you will have a big kind of duplication of effort in many places. And you will have, we take this kind of bounded context and domain-driven design language, and you will basically have these bounded contexts that are duplicated in different departments, right? And if you start bringing the organizations together with the view of creating a more holistic domain view on what the systems should be doing from a domain perspective, and how that domain then applies to the actual systems, and where there's duplication and where there should be one, and where you can even in domain-driven design, you have this context map, and you can start creating this context map and mapping the systems underneath it and working together and creating a common evolution strategy on what goes where, and even a common agreement around who owns what and those kind of things. You don't have to have this revolution within your organization to then start working together. So I think there are ways to actually start to bring these things together, but it actually involves people working together and using some nice tools that are out there in terms of domain modeling and so on to kind of create a strategy, a technical strategy around this evolution, basically.
And those things, they need to be reviewed often as well. Like, so mainly at the level that we are talking about, like the bounded context we are talking about, like at quite a high level in terms of system level, department level, and all this kind of stuff. So those things, they need to be reviewed often. Like, and by often, I mean like every 6, maybe 12 months. You need to I like the idea of having these kind of high-level context mapping. So with the domain bounded context and like 1 or 2 levels of sub-context as well, right? So to understand what is inside this box, right? How many other smaller boxes are inside? How many of those? How much information from that small box should be provided to the other?
Yeah, and what kind of
domains?
dependencies exactly? Like
Exactly.
what's the relationship within them, which is what a lot of that integration has to deal with, right? It's not so much what needs to be done within the concept, but how that interacts with everything else, no?
Exactly. So the degree of interaction across domains is different, and you need to keep reviewing that every 12 months, and then have a plan to make those changes as the business evolve, like almost like as a continuous improvement program, right?
Exactly.
As we say,
Exactly.
you are always recalibrating. It's almost like a refactoring, but at an architectural level, right?
Yeah.
So you're always recalibrating the business, so you never need to go through a big bang, change everything at architectural level.
Mm-hmm.
So there is another area that it would be interesting to discuss. We've seen in a lot of large organizations, even in smaller ones, but it's not only about the size of the organization. The size just makes things more complex, but make the problem bigger. But it's regulations, for example, or certifications. So there are quite a lot of systems that will need to be compliant to regulations. And we've been in many different industries, from finance to pharmaceuticals to even logistics. And so even the retail as well, when you talk about PCI compliance, for example, or data security and GDPR and things like that. So those are all the different types of. So because I've seen that quite often, because of the compliance with all those different types of regulations, a lot of processes are put in place, right? So people to make a change in the system, they need to have a design document. They need to be reviewed by someone else, or before you release a software to production, you need to go through a certain process or multiple reviews or whatever, right? There is a lot of processes that are created just to make sure that whatever is being built is compliant. And in some organizations, they have full departments that is compliance and standards, right? So this is a very important department that they will create all those processes. And the reason I'm giving that context is because the way that the systems are architected have a big impact in how those processes are created. And the how can I say, and how wide those processes are applied across the organization. Because, for example, in systems where everything's a bit together, right? Not only in a monolith, but the systems are quite large. And people, and when we are architecting those systems, we don't take that perspective into account. We force the entire system to be under those processes. But a way to simplify process in organization, or at least reduce the area where certain processes are needed, is with isolating those areas. It's not only the bounded context that we take into account just the business flow or the communication flow, but also those operational constraints or regulatory constraints, and isolating them restricts significantly where certain process needs to be applicable. And that's another way that a better architecture could create a very positive impact in the process of the organization.
Sorry, Jose.
The example that you're probably thinking of as well is, you mentioned PCI compliance and so on. If that is inside,
this is
your
one,
system,
yeah, exactly. But there are many others.
Extracting that, right, would allow you to follow different processes, right, or release cadences and so on, right, for each part of the system, right. We have another example where you're deploying maybe software on the edge in a lab somewhere, or under certain conditions. Like, if you, every time that you're deploying what you need to put in the machines, you're having to go through the whole thing, that makes your release cycle really long. What if you could deploy the foundation, that goes through the security checks and all of that, and then be able to deploy specific parts of the system through a different mechanism, for instance, right? So there's definitely a lot of advantages to gain from a business perspective and from a development perspective. Decoupling, those.
I've got a lot of anecdotes in this area, but kind of almost on the reverse side. Whereas you can use architecture, or the way you architect your software, to simplify regulatory processes. But on the other end, I've seen many complications in software architecture that are attributed to, because it's that's what regulation says. That it's regulatory. So like, okay, then I'm not gonna say. I once had I was working in a kind of a department that there was a lot of things that were being done, and this was particularly related to the release processes, right? And there was an idea that they had auditors that had come, and they had okayed a particular release process, and they had automated, or not automated it, but they had centralized it, because then they thought, well, if everybody uses this release process, then it's been given the blessing from auditors. So our release process does not need to go through a separate audit, because we will use this release process. The problem was that release process was atrocious. It was horrible. It was putting because it was centralized, there was queues, there were wait times for your test environment builds. It was super restrictive. And then I was once told, actually, we started a new team, and they said, I'm not using this process. We're going to create our own. And I was told that this was way above my pay grade to fight that fight. This also happens, right? Almost these kind of regulatory reasons or organizational reasons are used and then codified in systems, and then it becomes like a holy cow. You can't change it because it has audit approval. I've got another quick
dependencies as well. Sorry, before you jump into that one, and dependencies, because if everyone is using that, then it becomes even harder to change it, right? Because then you now need to attend the needs of everyone else who's actually using that thing, right? So it's not that easy.
And by the way, I did, in this particular case, I did go and fight that fight, and it turned out all the auditors required was this idea of an immutable release. And all the centralized system was doing to satisfy the auditors were providing immutable releases, and that was it. And everything else around it was just gumph. But people were using it because it was audit approved. I have a slightly different anecdote as well. I thought people might find it interesting. Is that we were working with Switzerland, and there was this idea of there is sharing of information, right? And their idea was that you can, rather than saying you can have the information, obviously the principle was that you can have the information on an as needed basis. So it could come out of the secure zone. You could ask for that on an as needed basis, right? However, it kind of transpired to that you can have this information if it's in memory, but you don't save it. So they had whole databases come sit in memory, completely violating the actual principle, which was that only share information that you need. But it came to like, oh, you're using this information, yeah. Are you gonna persist it? No, it's gonna be only memory. Okay, then you can have it. It's also another way of kind of complicating, kind of almost making architectural decisions as the and making those the kind of primary principle rather than the principle that are there to implement.
There is another example that I just remembered in how a better architecture can cause a significant organizational impact. It's different from some of the things that we were mentioning. There were quite a few times that we discussed with organizations where they had a service, right? So they had a product, a software product, but different clients, they wanted different types of customizations. And I remember that we were talking to the most recent example. It's been a few years now. They had like, it's almost like a system for car dealers, right? So, but across the world. And of course that the rules for financing a car were checking for credits and many other things that they did, and insurance and so on and so forth, and paying taxes and services, and all this kind of stuff. That varied massively from country to country. And even like from even car dealers to car dealers as well, they had differences. So they had a single product, but because different clients wanted different things, they started customizing their product, but different clients wanted different changes. So then what they end up with? They end up with copies of that system, that certain clients had one version of that system that could not be used in another version. And some of the versions had evolved so far that they could not be brought together anymore. They were just a different product. And that's when you are in a mix. And we've seen, this is just the most recent that I remember, but like we spoke to quite a few companies in the past with exactly the same problem, where they were a product company, but they were operating far more as a service company, where each one of their clients had people dedicated to them just to do their changes. And the problem was even bigger because it made it very difficult to sell their product. Because when you were selling, because it was all intertwined and they had different versions, they had to sell all the features together. And switching on features on and off became really complex when you have all those discrepancies that certain clients don't even have certain features available to them as part of the thing. So, and this is like, I remember like such an interesting conversation because, for example, the architecture was not allowing them to remain a product company and easily customize their systems to their clients, but most importantly, even be able to offer different packages and different levels to their customers. So, and I remember us discussing a plugin architecture, for example, where they could, so a plugin architecture in that case would have allowed to replace entire modules from the financing model, from the whatever services model, and whatever else, and also sell the product at different levels, the platinum, the gold, and silver. If you buy these, you get more features, and so on and so forth. So they didn't have the flexibility, and what was holding them back was the architecture. So evolving the architecture of that product would create a huge business flexibility to evolve that product. So that's another example that I just came back to my mind.
It's interesting.
Sorry, I'm aware of time, and I thought maybe we want to discuss a few other things. In particular, there is we wanted to talk about splitting of capabilities or architecture along. Splitting architecture around capabilities like front end, back end, and kind of mobile teams and that kind of thing. I think that's an important thing that we should have a quick chat about, and maybe around environments and those kind of things maybe as well. So I mean, I can start around the. I mean, unless there's something that we want to kind of finish up on what we were talking about earlier? No,
that's
okay,
fine.
so
Yeah.
yeah. So I think on the front end, back end side of things, right? I mean, we've got a few different architectures that are in play that allow you to have different kind of models, and they have pros and cons. And I think we've faced a lot of those decisions in the past as well. In particular, there is this kind of front end, back end thing, and we which is, we often see backend teams just building APIs, as it were, and then you got front-end teams. And in fact, we've seen companies that have actually tried to go in this way, where they call backend engineering and front-end digital and that kind of stuff, and completely draw that line between those and have some catastrophic results trying to do that. But I think it'll be good to have a quick chat on why is there in this particular case, for example, front-end versus backend. Is there ever a case to have front-end teams separated from back-end teams? And when we say front-end, we mean UI, basically, and the back-end is the kind of the logic or the that's happening.
I have mixed feelings about this one. For me, it's not a clear cut. I think that most people would expect, oh yeah, we should have cross-functional teams and that's it, and blah blah. I have mixed feelings. I'll explain why. I think that the front end specifically, like let's take modern applications. And what do I mean by modern applications? Where you have some small services at the back, call it microservices if you want, but we have a few well-defined services with well-defined APIs, but they don't know how that information is consumed. So I like the separation, the physical separation of the front end from the back end. In terms of architectural part, I'm not talking about people yet. I'm gonna get to people. Yeah. So I like the idea of the separation, the physical separation of the front end, and we can even, like, the front end can be even subdivided by micro front ends and all the different patterns that you can apply just on the front end side. The reason that I like that approach is because you can change the user journey, purely changing how the front end is approached. So just changing the front end and create different user journeys on the web or on the mobile, without having to change the back end, as long as the APIs are designed in a way that can support that. Yeah. So that physical architectural separate, I like. Now it gets to people. Assuming that we have that separation, the backend services are easy for a team to own them, because normally they are a part of a domain. The front end, although there is micro front ends today, is normally a bit more together. There is more consistency to be kept. The backend, you can afford to have different services implementing things in a different way. They can manage transactions in a different way. They can even use completely different technologies or programming languages, although I personally would discourage a bit. But like the front end, there is more to keep the consistency in terms of the layout, in terms of the design, in terms of... So sometimes when you have cross-functional teams, I feel that the front end might become very messy because there's no ownership. The ownership of the front end becomes a bit blurred. So this is why I have mixed feelings. It can work well, but it's not as a clear cut for me.
Yeah, I mean, there are aspects that you can do to make it work well.
Oh, sorry, Mashooq. Just before you go, and front end is not only the web. This is what I wanted to say as well, because you have the mobile as a front end as well. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and that's actually a separate question, and often ends up being it's
because they're just channels. They're different channels to provide.
No, they are different channels, but the technology stacks related to web, and it depends on what technology you use. We talk about very much native apps, right? Native app development is almost a discipline in its own, right? And often native apps are built as a monolith. Kind of splitting them out is not an easy task. Splitting web based kind of interfaces is or browser based interfaces or apps that are built with browser based type technologies is there is more let's say standards or more ways of working out there that allow you to do it. And we've always found that thing where if you, for example, if you try to kind of split a mobile app, it's, I mean, personally I haven't seen it done well, but I have seen web UIs split into micro front ends done in a very nice way, and still keeping the consistency through shared styles and components, web components and those kind of things, component libraries and those kind of things. So you keep that consistency, even keeping the communication between those components quite nice, but still providing these kind of cross-functional teams that are doing the front end and the
consistency, just to explore this a bit more, that consistency normally is done by a group of people that could be representatives of those different teams, those different cross-functional teams. But
yeah.
You need to have, in terms of organizational impact with that architecture, there is a need to, let's say, look after a group of people to look after the consistency of the front end,
it kind of works almost in a similar way to platform versus product, right? And it can work in that way. So you can have people dedicated towards ensuring that certain standards are kept, that they are building certain kind of components and so on. And cross-functional teams that have both front and back end capability that are then leveraging those libraries almost, and the common styles and so on, and style guides and so on to actually build features out.
Hey, so if I may jump in, there's something you said, Mash, that I don't entirely agree with. No, this idea that usually mobile tends to be more in the monolith. I agree that it tends to be deployed as one unit because of, you don't normally deploy specific, but within the application you can, like Spotify, for instance, is an example of that, where components themselves are owned by different teams and so on, and it's not there is separation between those. Now, the other problem that Sandro is mentioning now, which is more around consistency in the journey, UI experience and so on. For me, that's a product thing. You know what I mean? Like, you could have that same problem if no one is making sure that it is consistent independently of the architecture that you're choosing to use, right? It is true that if you have a lot of separation, like the component approach that we were talking about, or micro front ends or whatever, right? And everyone is doing whatever they want. No, let's say you have someone leading product on this area, let's say ads, right? Components related to ad and upselling and showing that's owned by the part of the domain is owned by team or a set of teams, and then you have, I don't know, classified, the around the actual items that you're selling or whatever, right? If everyone is doing whatever they want and there's no guidelines on style, on user experience or solutions, let's say, to the different problems within the app, you can get this kind of schizophrenic application, right? Like, you open a screen and it's something completely different than another one, and this works this way, and then another. But that's, for me, a matter of alignment around product more than it is a matter of architecture itself, right?
But like,
for me,
what I was saying is, Jose, is that I agree to a degree in what you were saying. I can see that. I had two different points. That one is, for example, there is, if you have the backends, let's say the services, you have like a microservice architecture. Although I would encourage those services to follow the same patterns, the same technology. As you open different services, you are in a well-known you're not surprised. You are comfortable. You recognize the patterns and the technology and so on. But it's not necessary that you do that. You don't need to put so much effort in that consistency. But in the front end, you need to, right? So you are first, because that experience, that thing that the user is going through, it needs to look the same, and you have multiple people from different teams touching on while in the back end you don't, right? Having consistency is great, but it's not as needed as it is, as much needed as it is needed in the front end. And the reason, the point that I'm making, of course, is all possible, but it has an organizational impact. And also, that is one pattern, having separate. Other patterns, for example, we work with Monolith, where the backend, the front end is generated through templates from the backend, and that creates a completely different dynamic in how
and a different set of problems.
A different set of problems, and this is what I'm saying. So the architecture doesn't have an implication in how those people collaborate, where they need to synchronize and align, the number of people that need to be aligned to provide the same work. And this is what I was coming from.
I would say that the number of people that need to be aligned is, the people that need to be aligned around the product, like providing consistency in the product, that's going to stay there. Like that's going to be a common point. What architecture does is it provides opportunities for things to be done differently and to make those trade-offs, right? Like you were mentioning, no, microservice, I could use the same thing, like a template and, same technology, but part of using microservices is also being able to change if I need to change, right? And
Sure.
and have that be, so it's providing the choices, is giving you the choices. But from a product perspective, that I don't think that's entirely true unless you have very separated, it's one platform, but, different products almost, you know what I mean? Like if you have one product and you have different people working on there, that you will have to have that coordination either way. And that for me, you can't get rid of that by just changing the architecture. I mean,
you can't get rid of it completely. I think this is one of those scenarios where there are pros and cons to both situations, right? But I think it depends on where the complexity is the most, and how you design your architecture is based on where the, if you cut the thing in one way, if you cut the thing, for example, to say, what, I'm just going to have a monolith front end and lots of backend microservices, right? You're making a certain kind of decision where you're saying that the communication between the front end people is way more important than the communication from the front end to the backend teams, because you're sacrificing. So because you don't have a cohesive vertical team, you're making that sacrifice, because you are in a way saying that this horizontal communication is of more value, right? On the other hand, what you're saying is that the vertical communication is of more value, but then now I'm sacrificing this kind of built-in cohesiveness that I get of the interface that I don't have to govern or manage, right? So what I'm saying is I'm valuing the vertical communication in this case, and then what I'm doing is putting structures in place to get some level of cohesiveness at the horizontal level, right? And it's basically you're making that decision, and in a way, I mean, this is why it's probably a difficult conversation, because this is different for different scenarios, right? Depending on the kind of product you have, depending on the complexity of the organization, the number of teams, all those kind of things, you actually, one may work over the other. Personally, I mean, if I to look at the default, I prefer the verticals that actually saying, because, if I have certain kind of standards in place, I can have autonomous-ish teams working on individual business features. On the other hand, I know that I always have to coordinate. There is no other way to.
There's no options. There's no options.
Yeah, but I know that we are over time, but I think this is quite a cool subject, and I just wanted to get a point across, because it's not only about coordination. all being equal, or for example, without any context, if you ask me, would you go for a separate front-end team and a separate back-end team, or you would go for a cross-functional team? Without any context, I normally would go for a cross-functional team, right? So, but there are a few things that, for example, let's follow through the e-commerce plot, because this is quite well known to everyone. For example, let's say that there are many things that the business wants to do. They want to, let's say, onboard a new payment method. They want to evolve their recommendation system, and they want to have multiple types of catalogs in different countries. So there are 3 different business efforts that you need to be done potentially by different teams in different bounded contexts and stuff. Those things take some time. So here I'm just describing, what is it called? Pressures in a specific bounded context, is pressure that specific bounded contexts have to change. And then a cross-functional team could deal with that. But there are also pressures that come purely just on the front end. You want to change the user journey. And the user journey goes across multiple bounded contexts. It comes from searching for the product, getting recommendation, then adding that to the basket. And then in there, you might have more recommendations or a discount or a promotion and stuff like that. So a user journey is full of things that the front end combine elements across the all bounded contexts, and they evolve independently from the back. Because you do user research, you do all this kind of stuff, and you are always trying to evolve. And this is where the pure vertical teams don't work well. Because like it would be far harder to have different people from all those different vertical teams to work together just because you want to change the new user journey, but use still the same, but still keep using the same APIs. And sometimes I see cases, this is what I'm trying to say. I'm not saying that I favor that. But what I was saying, that for me is not a clear cut, because I see that there is a lot of pressure just to change the front ends, and that includes the mobile and the web, that not necessarily will change the back end. And this is common.
Mm-hmm. Right. I know an example of one organization, and I know this pressure is there, and it's a very good point that when, you still have to think of the thing holistically, and this actually and if you're talking about just in pure kind of outside the context, you don't have to evolve organizations and just start with that, then maybe. But at what point you say, well, the team is just gonna look at user journeys, or how much is it across and how much is it just verticals? But we know of an organization that actually kind of had problems with their e-commerce solution, which is a very large organization. And what they did was they went through this big transformation. They had gone through this, where they went to cross-functional teams, and they had a really good culture in the organization. And they then decided that this is the thing I was thinking, like they had engineering, which was the back end, and so they split these teams right down the middle, engineering and digital. And it caused a catastrophic, but I think this was also to do with how they made that change happen. But they lost about 80% of their people.
Yeah, this is what I said. I was just trying to do the devil's advocate, because it's very easy to say, cross-functional team is the solution for everything. And I the whole point is
it may not be the solution for everything. It may not be the solution, but I definitely have a preference for for that.
Yeah.
Just banking on the having the right skill set in order to get a unit of work done, right? Like delivering value in a constant kind of stream, right? Like not having to wait, stop in that
the handover,
and all of these things. Just trying to avoid that, for me, it already provides certain benefits that you can do. It's not always the case, right? Like sometimes you go to an organization and they're already structured in a very different way, and you have to work around certain constraints and that kind of stuff. But
I think that you need to analyze the grain of changes over time, because some changes will be a vertical change. It will be a very clean, it's just in the catalog domain, the catalog area, or in the payments area, or so on and so forth. Some changes are very square, very vertical. Cross-functional teamwork works well. But there are chains, there are cross-cutting concerns that will change across. And then we need, for me, this is why I said that it's not clear how often those chains come. And then, like, if they're coming too often, then we need to then another way of looking at it, do we have the wrong bounded context? Because if the chains are always going across bounded context, maybe the definition of bounded context
is
wrong.
not correct.
Not correct.
Yeah.
Exactly.
exactly.
So
it's more about splitting.
Yeah, exactly. So those are things that the architecture has that impact in how people collaborate, how people understand the system and are organized. So cool. I think we are a bit over time, aren't we? As always.
Yeah. There is one thing that we didn't touch on, which is the impact that architecture has on business financials, for instance, the whole capex versus opex kind of approach, and that which is also kind of like a mind change in many organizations, because people are used to, I buy my servers and I have everything in my data center, etc., right, versus going to the cloud and serverless and all these things that I no longer have a clear picture of what this is going to cost me and so on, right? And that's a big mindset change as well. But we're over time, so
related to that is the whole environment things that I said we may want to talk about. But I think it's safe to say that this is a huge topic. There's quite a few things that we haven't discussed on it, but maybe another time.
Yeah. Cool. Maybe have a part 2.
Yeah.
Okay. Shall we wrap up?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, as always, like if people like this episode or all the conversation we're having, subscribe to the channel so you are notified when there are new episodes. Give us a thumbs up and add into the comments if there is anything you would like us to discuss. We'll be more than happy to pick up the topic. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.